Well, hey everybody, how you doing? I'm going to be interviewing someone that I've had a long-standing relationship with. His name is Mike Grynbaum, and our relationship goes back, I don't know, at least over 20 years, because Mike and my son, Simon Vozick-Levinson, were both at Harvard University then, working at the Crimson, Harvard University's newspaper, that is the student newspaper. And I remember that Simon told me that the people on that editorial board, when you started working at the Crimson, said, "Hey, it's like a younger version of you, Simon. So you must have had something on the ball." But then we did a lot of things, dinners together and so forth. But I think the next time we actually did something significant in the public realm was you presented a paper at the conference on The Sopranos that I organized, I guess, about a year after the show ended. And by the way, that paper is in a book about The Sopranos, and I'll have a link to that book in the show notes. And then, last but not least, we just saw each other a couple of months ago because we went to see somewhere down in the village Grios Kwiatkowski at his group Trupa Trupa. I don't know, some kind of neo punk group, but they're actually a very good group, I think, with my limited knowledge in music. So, with all of that in mind, I was delighted to find out that evening, Mike, that you were going to be coming out with a new book called Empire of the Elite. It's a book about Condé Nast. And let me say, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we have our conversation. I had a direct experience with Condé Nast because, as a science fiction writer, I was a devoted reader of Analog magazine, which for a good couple of decades was one of the magazines that Condé Nast published. Now, I noticed you said in your book you didn't cover everything that Condé Nast published, and obviously science fiction is not as important as the New Yorker and Vogue and Vanity Fair and so forth. But the name always meant something to me. But let's start with, why did you take on this project? Were you some avid reader of the New Yorker? Were you madly in love with Tina Brown? What was it that got you to write this book?
Yeah, well, first, Paul, thank you so much for having me. This is one of my first podcasts that I'm doing to talk about the book, and I was really pleased that you asked me to do it. I should add that Paul's son Simon, since we met, probably one of my first weeks in college, has been, remained my best friend and was officiated my wedding back in 2019. And actually, Simon was one of the only readers of my manuscript before I submitted it. He went through, which is a labor of love, certainly, having to sift through a lot of pages of raw copy. So he had a important hand in the book as well. Um, I'm a media reporter at the New York Times, and when the pandemic began, I'd been thinking about doing a book project for a while. It's always something I'd thought about doing, and I was trying to think of a topic that would sort of sustain my interest for 2, 3, 4 years, however long the process takes. And you're absolutely right. I grew up loving the magazines of Condé Nast. I first encountered the New Yorker in the 1990s under Tina Brown's editorship. And I think that the writing in the New Yorker was so influential for me and really was in my formative years developing sort of my style as a writer. Um, you know, those stories were always, so exceptionally done, stylish and witty. And magazines like Vanity Fair offered this invitation into a world of sophistication that was like kind of just out of reach. I grew up in the suburbs of Hartford, Connecticut, a well-to-do town, but away from New York City, away from certainly nowhere near, the European capitals. And, these magazines offered kind of a monthly escape into these glamorous worlds. And I was always so fascinated at the influence they had over many decades, and also the fact that the company had declined so much by the time 2020 came around. It had really shrunk, and its power had uh, eroded. And so I wanted to explore all of that. And frankly, I was very surprised I couldn't find a book that did it. There have been a lot of memoirs by Condé Nast editors, but no one had really taken a journalistic approach to the company and its history. And so that was what I set out to do.
That's very interesting. And one of the things that you mentioned, which of course is pretty much the backdrop of the entire book, but you get to it in detail, especially near the end, because what you're talking about is something that no longer is the case. And as someone who uses the internet, you have social media accounts on all the systems, and switching for a second as moving to the person who's doing the reading rather than the writing. Honestly, how much do you miss that print milieu where anything and everything you read was on a page, printed page of paper? And I'll set this up by saying, honestly, I don't miss it too much at all. And my wife, Tina, my wife, she still, reads the Sunday New York Times. Anything and everything that I read in the New York Times is on a screen. And to tell you the truth, I was glad there was a PDF available of your book. And usually when I buy a book, if I buy a book, it's almost always on a Kindle. Why wouldn't I? I want to get the book immediately. I want to be able to look at the book on my phone, all the advantages of social media. So, how do you feel about that?
Well, I look, there's no question the delivery systems are so much more efficient now. And in a way, look, I work at the New York Times where, I grew up reading the print newspaper, which was always, I couldn't wait every morning to go downstairs and read this beautifully laid out, Daily Miracle. But the truth is, the New York Times readership today is exponentially higher than it was back when it was distributed through trucks and, printing plants. I mean, I have readers now all over the world who can access what I write instantly. And so there's no question that there's been some, great advantages to the way that our information systems have shifted in the last few years. Um, I think what I miss, and um, I think, smart minds can disagree about this, but the cacophony of the internet and sort of the chaos of media today, that's something that I don't like so much. Condé Nast, these magazines, they would kind of arrive in your mailbox once a month. And, in this beautifully designed package, you would find out what books were worth reading and what movies were worth seeing. And, here are the clothes that people are talking about in Europe. And here's some decorating ideas, for your house. And, I mean, Condé magazines covered the gamut of lifestyle journalism. But there was something kind of reassuring about having this sort of coherent presentation, that just arrived, and you didn't really have to work for it. You didn't have to sift through all the raw data yourself. And I do think that there is some value to that. And I do think people in some ways yearn for that. I think there is a bit of nostalgia for that period. And I'm not pretending, my book is a warts and all look at this company, and there were a lot of problems with it as an institution. But that is an element of print that I personally still miss.
Well, I think it's a fascinating and important point, and I think your book makes a lot of original contributions. And one of them, apropos of this topic, is there's been a hue and cry about the digital world versus books. since the internet was first something that became public. Oh, I grew up holding a book in my hand. Oh my God, even when I was a kid, I saw that, I had all these picture books. But your book is the first time I ever remember, recall, or have come across someone who yearns to some extent, not for the paper of the book per se, but the paper of the magazine. And of course, Marshall McLuhan would say that's extremely important. The medium is the message. There's a difference between reading something in a book, and the magazine. And, you have that, and you talk about that throughout your book. At some point you talk about people who have like stacks of New Yorker magazines on their bedstands, and for better or worse, because why are they stacked there? Maybe because they didn't yet read them, but on the other hand, it was sort of like a comforting, status symbol. But
Well, I thought a lot about McLuhan actually, and you and I have talked about him, extensively. But I thought about him when, so part of the reason why Condé Nast missed the internet so badly, and what really was kind of an original sin of their business model just collapsing in the age of the internet, was that Cy Newhouse, who was the mercurial billionaire who ran Condé Nast and was its chief benefactor. Um, he loved the feel of a glossy magazine. If you think about those old issues of Vanity Fair, they were, eye-popping colors, and the feel of it in your hand was sort of luxurious. And, their business model was built on luxury advertising, perfumes, designers, alcohol, sort of, department stores. And he was convinced that these clothing, these clothing companies, they wouldn't pay as much to advertise on the internet where you have this flat screen where you don't kind of get that sensual experience that you might get from the page. And it's funny to think about it now, right? I mean, it feels like a very old-fashioned thinking, but back in 1998, he thought to himself, well, why am I going to, I'm making so much money from, these print ads, why am I going to invest in this crazy new internet where it's a wild west and who knows who's posting on there? And, I'm creating a safe space for these advertisers. And so the actual physical attributes of the medium, he was so taken by them that I think it blinded the company to what was coming. And they just couldn't imagine, and this has to do with kind of the imperiousness of Condé Nast as an institution. They couldn't imagine a time when people wouldn't want to have the pleasure of that print product. To them, it was axiomatic that that's how you would want to read about, luxury and wealth and affluence. And so they never really built an infrastructure to adjust to the internet. And by the time it dawned on them I trace this to around the time of the 2008 crash, but by the time, which coincides, by the way, with the iPhone's mass distribution, by the time that moment came, they were very ill prepared. And you've really seen over the last 15 years kind of a rear guard move action by them trying to catch up with technology. And they're still, I think, really stumbling, their way through that.
yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, that even though ultimately it boils down to words, to written words. And so that's literally ultimately what's communicated, right, through any magazine, any book. I mean, you have audiobooks or whatever, that it's so important how those words are packaged. And that makes all the difference. One of the things which I can't resist talking about, and I felt a little deprived having read the PDF version, because I'm sure the actual book has actual images in there of some of the things you talk about. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this, to our viewers and listeners. That'll be like an incentive for them, another incentive to buy the book. were, if I understood what I was reading correctly, whether it was Tina or Anna or just about everyone who was so successful, every chance they got, they put a nude on the cover or a partial nude, and we expect this from Playboy and Penthouse, but to have anything that has to do with fashion, okay, if it's fashion, you want the people to look good, but there's a big difference, right, between looking good in a dress or jeans or whatever and looking good not wearing anything.
Um, Tina has a saying, which is I've always believed in lapses of taste. And it's true that there always was a illicit factor to, these magazines in trying to appeal to readers. And there are famous Vogue spreads that ostensibly are about fashion, but feature partial or full nudity of models wearing very little at all. There's a famous Richard Avedon photograph of Natasha Kinski where a snake is kind of wrapped around her body and she's wearing is a bracelet. So it's one of the most famous fashion photographs, but there isn't a lot of fashion in it. I think, look, it was a business, and they were looking for ways to draw in readers with actually the Demi Moore cover, the pregnant Demi Moore cover, which is probably the most famous Vanity Fair cover ever, I would argue, from 1992 or 1991, I should say. It's amazing what a stir that caused when it came out. It was her nude, sort of demurely covering her breasts, but her pregnant belly is exposed, and I mean, there was like a evangelical meltdown over that photograph on the cover, and newsstands would put a paper bag over it, and it was discussed on the news, and how could Tina Brown have done this, and isn't this outrageous? And you look at our culture today, it's like wouldn't even register. Um, and in this funny way, there's almost a weirdly feminist reading of that cover, which is that it was, saying, well, pregnancy is beautiful, in a way that hadn't been seen on a magazine before. It also had a cynical reading, which is she wanted to sell magazines. So there's a number of ways you could look at it. Um, I do have some photographs in the book. If your listeners look at the hardcover, there's a beautiful photo insert. Some of the more iconic photos are not in there. Condé Nast didn't cooperate with me on the book. They turned down my inquiries, and they didn't want me talking to current editors. I still talk to many current editors, just without their official. It wasn't through the official channels. But part of that was that I wasn't able to access their pictorial archives. So some of those images, they're widely available online. You could probably link to a few of them actually in your story notes, uh, but I did find what I think are some really great images from the 80s and 90s that capture the personalities and the excess and the sort of electricity of this company at its peak. And I think it's going to be a really fun addition, a sort of good reason to read the book in print.
I agree. I'm sure it is. Listen, I have to, even though I hate the guy and I don't even enjoy talking about him at all, because I have no choice but to talk about him in my classes, and the threat he's posing to our democracy on an hourly basis. And so I was both happy and unhappy to see that he plays a role in Empire of the Elite as well. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. That is, to what extent, I mean, you make the point based on your research that at the beginning of Trump's public career, had it not been for Condé Nast, we wouldn't have even heard of Trump. I mean, if that's true, and you make a convincing case for it, wow, I mean, already that one thing could be considered a more important impact of Condé Nast than everything and anything that anyone else did in the past 50 years through Condé Nast.
Well, as an aficionado of classic sci-fi, you of course know the is it the Robert Heinlein story about the butter crushing the time travelers crush the butterfly and the
Ray Bradbury, but
Ray Bradbury,
yeah,
excuse me. Which by the way ends with like a fascist president taking over the country. Isn't that
yes.
was calling this back from grade school. Um, uh, there's no question that Condé Nast, as ultimately in writing about any American cultural institution in the last 50 years, funnily enough, Donald Trump ends up having a cameo role. Um, you know, the Condé Nast of the 80s, which really embraced the materialism of that era, and I think this kind of new wealth of that was fueled by Wall Street and the Reagan kind of happy Alex P. Keaton capitalism that was preeminent then. A lot of ways Trump was an avatar of that. I mean, he represented all of the excesses and uh, um, issues with that cultural moment. And he was on the cover of GQ magazine, and it sold well. And Cy Newhouse thought that maybe you know he also owned Random House, the book publisher, and thought that Trump might be a selling asset for a book. And the bizarre historical coincidence is that Cy Newhouse's best friend from childhood, from going to Horace Mann, was Roy Cohn, the notorious McCarthyite lawyer. And Roy Cohn and Cy Newhouse were friends. They talked every day for their entire lives, which very few people know about. And Roy Cohn, of course, was Trump's tutor. And through various machinations, this book, The Art of the Deal, was created and sold to Random House. It was a big bestseller. And then you see Trump flitting in and out of Condé Nast history. He proposed to Melania at a Met Gala, a Vogue Met Gala, which many people don't remember. He was taking advantage of the publicity blitz surrounding that. And I think the fact that I found most fascinating was that after his victory in November 2016, a lot of people were coming to Trump Tower to meet with him, and he only deigned to visit, to actually physically go to two media institutions. One was the New York Times, and I was in that meeting. I was covering it as a reporter, and it was a pretty extraordinary moment. You walked in, shook hands of everyone. It was very, this was just a few weeks after the election. But the other place he went was Condé Nast, which is kind of hilarious because by 2016, I mean, Condé Nast's influence had already shrunk. I mean, this was not, changing the hearts and minds of swing state voters, but it mattered to him. It represented the Manhattan elites that he had yearned to join for so much of his life. And so he actually went down there at the invitation of Anna Wintour to meet with the editors in chief. And that tableau strikes me as just so extraordinary. I mean, what a bizarre moment that he's meeting with the editor of Vogue, like after he becomes president of the United States. It almost speaks to some of the surreal nature of that moment in political history. So for your readers who are interested in that, I have a chapter on it, but I kept it to one chapter. So if you're looking for a Trump-free reading experience, you can skip right to the next one. The narrative continues. You won't miss anything. But if you are interested in a bit of that history, I did include it in there.
Yeah, it's an important part of history. And you mentioned in your book the Trump bump, which has different meanings,
Mm,
uh, slightly different meanings. But I always took it to mean that if you look, for example, at the New York Times, they're suffering like all print publications as we get into the 20 teens and so forth.
yeah.
And suddenly, Trump's election, their circulation skyrockets after the election because progressive people, one could say, I would say sane people, want to read a somewhat honest appraisal of what actually is going on. And by the way, as a professor, I often say to my students and anybody who's listening to me that actually, Trump has done my career a great benefit because I don't have to think about what I'm going to be putting in the syllabus anymore. Since Trump's been elected, whatever I have in the syllabus, just about every day I walk into a class or log on to a class teaching, a class in, media and politics, whatever the class is, there's some horrendous thing that Trump has done that I need to address to the class. So the Trump bump not only helped the New York Times and other print publications, the Washington Post also, which, by the way, that's what makes what Jeff Bezos more recently did so horrible. The paper that said democracy dies in darkness, now kowtows to some extent to Trump. But on a personal level, he's made the work of newspapers, journalists, professors, people who are doing what you're doing and what I'm doing a lot easier because he's given us something to talk about.
Can I
I
can I ask you, Paul, a question, a McLuhan question
Go ahead.
related?
Yeah.
I was wondering, have you thrown out your collection of vinyl records?
Have I thrown them out? No, absolutely not. And
So why do you hang on to your vinyl when you can so conveniently listen to music on a laptop or on Spotify?
two reasons. Number one, the speaker system, and this is just my laziness. I know you can hook up a computer or even a phone to a superb speaker system, but I'm too lazy to do that. So if I want to hear something with like all the presence of a vinyl, that only a needle going over the vinyl can give you. There's nothing like listening, to the vinyl. And so I was very happy, for example, as some people know out there who are watching and listening to this. Unfortunately, not millions of people, but maybe a little more than a handful of people. In 2020, I came out with a new album, Welcome Up Songs of Space and Time. A company by the name of Old Bear Records put it out, and then Light in the Attic put out a beautiful vinyl of it. So I got a chance then to listen to songs that I wrote and sang on Spotify, on a CD. They still put out CDs, and on vinyl. And there's just no comparison. There's a warmth. A lot of people have written about it more eloquently than I. A scratchiness
Well,
on.
I think there is a group of magazine enthusiasts who they have the same attitude toward the print magazines of an earlier era, where even that word warmth that you're mentioning, I think they feel the same way that the photographs on the page and the sort of presentation of them tells a story or sort of evokes a certain emotional response that like the photograph on a screen, on a flat LCD screen, just can't quite replicate. It's sort of like it's almost like a print equivalent of that scratchy warmth of the vinyl needle. And the other thing I'd say is that I love vinyl records, and I love the records from the 70s, the concept albums where you would have the artwork and the lyrics and sort of the accompanying liner notes. And it would almost be, I mean, that it almost felt like that was an extension of the music, right? That your experience of the record was so much about the presentation of this tangible object. And so I would just draw a comparison to, I think, people who still yearn for that era of magazines and collect vintage magazines. And I think that they're seeking a similar, I think it's a similar uh, sort of motivation, which is that the medium of the old magazines changes the content of that we would otherwise consume digitally today.
No, I think you're right. I mean, and certainly McLuhan would say, and I certainly would agree with this, uh, there is a tactile sense. And so, in terms of a magazine, a book, a newspaper, yes, the main deal is your eyes are decoding those scribbles and getting meaning out of that. But
Yeah,
while you're doing it, your hands are involved, in that as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
And that, I think that does make a big difference. One of the things, by the way, I always do in interviews is, I get my frustrations out by asking the author, why didn't you do this rather than that? And of
Sure.
course, the answer is, well, hey, I didn't write the book. So, of course, you didn't put in what I might wanted to have put in, but
Uh-huh.
nonetheless, I still get pleasure from doing that. So let me ask you one thing that popped out at me. You talk a little bit about Klaus von Bülow. He's the guy who was accused of trying to kill his wife with insulin injections, and you point out correctly that Klaus von Bülow was acquitted. But why then didn't you mention that Alan Dershowitz, who then later became a great Trump supporter, was his defense attorney?
Oh, well, let me say that I'm a big fan of Reversal of Fortune. Is that the name of the film? Th Which is a dramatization of the Von Bülow story with Jeremy Irons as Von Bülow, and Alan Dershowitz is a main character. And I'm blanking now on the actor who plays him.
Paul
Ron,
Giamatti?
I can't remember, but it's a wonderful film.
Yes, it is.
And Dershowitz, it's so funny to see him sort of play it as a character. I'm going to give you an unsatisfying answer, which is,
Okay.
look, the hardest part of this book was really kind of chiseling it down into a, uh, a size that you could wrap your hands around. I mean, I was joking with my wife that I could have done this as a 3 volume, Robert Caro set, I could have done a whole book on Condé Nast from 1900 to 1950. And my wife said, well, it's not Lyndon Johnson, it's Condé Nast. So, maybe it's not worthy of that size. But no, I just, I tried to get in as many fun details as I could, but some information ultimately was extraneous. And the Klaus von Bülow comes up because Vanity Fair wrote this cover story about him and shot him. Helmut Newton, the great photographer, shot this memorable photograph of him in a sort of a leather S&M outfit, and it's a very distinctive photograph. And people were scandalized because he was an accused murderer, so Dershowitz just was a little tangential, and he could have been a footnote, but maybe in the paperback, I'm keeping notes of what I should have included. So if I get it in the paperback, that's your footnote.
Great. All right, I can go on and on with that, but there are other little things I try to do in interviews. Another category is I honestly didn't know this at all, and I was stunned, to find this out. And there are actually a few things, but I just want to mention one, and maybe you can tell us more about this. Barbara Walters, she was Roy Cohn's sometimes girlfriend.
Yes, it's true. Roy Cohn, well, if you think about Angels in America, I mean, think about how vivid and memorable the Roy Cohn character is, right? I mean, it's such a searing portrayal, but everyone who met him, even people who loathed his ideology, found him incredibly charming. I found this across the board. I would talk to people who said, they would meet him at a dinner party and think, my God, I'm sitting next to Roy Cohn, this savage. He had convicted the Rosenbergs. I mean, the sins of this man. And before long, they'd find themselves, just sort of laughing away. Like he had this charm to him. And in I think it was the 50s or 60s. I don't quite have it in my head, the exact date, but Barbara Walters, they would go out on the town together, and he would go on double dates with her. I tried to speak to Walters actually before her death. She didn't respond to my inquiries about this, but I mean, Cohn was a closeted gay man, and I don't know whether his relationships with women were ever consummated, or maybe they were very consciously a uh, a
A show.
a show. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, to mask his identity. But yes, he would go to the 21 Club with Barbara Walters. He would go on the town with her. He was a very, he would go to Studio 54 in the 70s. I mean, he had his birthday party there. And there's, I mean, these are such bizarre juxtapositions. And part of the joy for me in reporting, writing the book was to explore these lost periods of New York City history. The book feels so much about New York and about the creative world of New York and kind of the worlds that were brought together in spaces in New York. And I think Studio 54, Condé Nast, these are all kind of gathering spots in the 20th century for important people in the culture. And I think that's part of the fun of the book is sort of the cameos, the walk-ons.
Well, absolutely, and you have many of them, and they're one of the joys of reading the book. I mean, I guess there are other examples of people that you can't imagine why they would want to spend any kind of personal time together. Didn't Ruth Bader Ginsburg go out to operas with Scalia?
Scalia.
Yes, I mean, my God, I mean, I wouldn't want to. I mean, I'd be interested in talking to him, but to spend like some social time with him,
Yeah.
and then what's his name? That Southern guy is married. That
James Carville and Mary Madeline. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, wow, what? But I mean, look, I guess that happens. So, boy, it's too bad that Barbara Walters didn't, respond to your request
I
because
know, I know. Actually, Kai Bird, who wrote American Prometheus, the Robert Oppenheimer biography, I believe is working on a Roy Cohn biography. I'm not sure when it will be out, but I'm hoping that will shed a little more light on that. But it is a fun anecdote.
yeah, okay. But I do want to give you the one more thing, and this is like such an idiotic, trivial thing, but it shows the way I read a book. Somewhere in the book, actually, pretty early on in the book, you talk about something, blah, 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 happening on the Boston Post Road. But anybody that
Yes.
comes from the Bronx knows that they would say you're going to Boston Post Road. Where did the come in there?
Wow, you've stumped me. You mean the way in Los Angeles they say the 405, not 405, and you're
Yeah,
saying it should be Boston Post Road, not the Boston.
100%. 100%. There's a great pizza place on Boston Post Road. There was a Carvel located on the Carvel cake. It's so
You
good.
know,
It was located at the intersection of Alton Avenue and
yeah,
Boston Post Road.
it's a colloquialism I missed, and I was being so careful about my on Long Island instead of in Long Islands. I was so attentive to those. Well, again, you've given me another fix. This is another fix for the paperback.
Okay, I'm going to have to take this up with Simon because he
You're earning your editor's fee here. Yeah, yeah.
All right, listen, let me tell you though, one of the many things I just loved in the book, I'm just going to read like literally part of a sentence. And when I read this typifies anybody who's watching this video and listening to the audio, why you should get this book. It's a treasure trove of these kinds of sentences. Joseph Mitchell, a legendary chronicler of New York City life who walked into the office every weekday morning, shut his door, and then departed around 5 p.m. Since 1964, he had not published a word in the magazine. So first of all, that's just a great nugget. Second of all, what? So all the editors, even before, Tina Brown were just so crazy it was okay that this guy, he just walked into his office. He was there, didn't produce a thing.
Well, Mitchell is probably the most notorious example of that lack of productivity. Although Fran Lebowitz, I believe, has been on the Vanity Fair payroll for many years and has not produced much in the way of a written, output, famously. Um, you know, uh, I mean, the New Yorker was always a safe house for eccentrics. It sort of embraced creative talent and it acknowledged that creatives were not 9 to 5 office workers. Efficiency a, was never really, I think, seen as a good asset for necessarily for a writer. I mean, we didn't live in the age where everything was measured in clicks and traffic. The New Yorker wanted to publish the best, and to give somebody like Joseph Mitchell, this talented, brilliant reporter, a home and sort of a place to ply his trade was seen as almost a public service. Not to me, I'm just I don't necessarily subscribe to that view, but that was certainly how they saw it. And the New Yorker, you have to remember, in the mid-century, made was I think one of the most profitable magazines in America because they sold huge amounts of advertising. If you go back through the archival issues in the library, it's just reams and reams of pages. They had to turn away advertisers. It was so they certainly had the money to spare, I think, at that time. But that became increasingly unsustainable. And I think when Tina Brown came in, she couldn't understand. She tried to get Mitchell to write a story about the South Street Seaport, which would have been up his alley as a kind of a writer of the New York demimonde, and he never handed in the assignment. So um, you know, maybe I'll try getting away with that at the Times. Let's see how long I can last going in day after day and not producing anything. I think they might notice a little more soon, more sooner than they would have at the New Yorker back then.
A good deal. Look, maybe he read other material that people were writing and he served as a quasi editor or something. I mean, just the image. I mean, it's almost, you can almost like have an SNL routine, like a time lapse thing.
Yeah, he was like the Bartleby of the New Yorker.
Yeah, I love it. It's just an example of the many gems that are in your book. You have a
And
great eye,
thank you, Paul.
and a great sense of humor, and it's just really a pleasure to read. Um, Let me go over just a couple of other things that I was delighted to read. The amount of money that was spent on articles. I mean, as somebody, I had never worked for a publication on a salary. I've had a lot of things published, but I've always been paid, per article. So when I read that Tom Wolfe was commissioned to write at an article at $12 a word. I mean, my God, you just do the arithmetic. If it's a 5 or 10,000 word article, uh, so that's really amazing. There is a whole thing in science fiction history that you might be interested in, that to try to explain to someone who didn't live like in the late 1940s, which is what the focus of it is that science fiction writers in the late 1940s, like Robert Heinlein, in fact, he was the one who often talked about this, that you could live for a year on the money you made by selling an article to the Saturday Evening Post, not an article, a story. And you talk about bygone times, that has really changed, although what you're talking about, regarding, what Tom Wolfe was offered and what other people were paid, that continues that whole thing.
It was so fun to hear these stories that just a story like that about Tom Wolfe, 12 Hours of World, a word. It's absurd. It was absurd at the time, by the way. This is in 2007, and even then people were shocked by it. It does remind you, though, that a lot of people resented Condé Nast for all the money it spent. In a way, it was subsidizing creative workers, writers, designers, photographers, layout artists, editors. I mean, unfortunately, so many of those jobs have disappeared today. There really were, hundreds of creative class workers who were able to have a middle class lifestyle because the company was paying a decent wage. And of course, there were some, outliers who were making these outrageous amounts. But with Condé closing a lot of its print titles and converting to digital only, a lot of those jobs have disappeared. So in a way, it was an institution that was helped subsidize a certain class of creatives, and that's gone today.
Yeah, and apropos of the New York Times, and in case our viewers and listeners don't know, Mike is part of the eminent news writing staff of journalists that work at the New York Times. and he's had a very, very important career. One of my favorite quotes, not in the book, is, "What did De Blasio say about you? You're not a very nice person," because he didn't like that. That's great. You should put that on your desk. I mean, blow that up, hang it up on a wall somewhere. Um, but the New York Times, as you probably know better than I, the joke used to be that you're a reporter working for the New York Times. The salary isn't that good, but at least you get an obituary.
Well, I am an institutionalist. I've been very fortunate to be at the New York Times through most of my career, and it's been it's a creative place, it's a competitive place, it's a place that cares deeply about the practice of journalism, and I've benefited from some of the institutional support that a place like that brings. I think there's some wonderful writers on Substack. I think that people have struck out on their own. I mean, there's great writing out there on the internet. But what is a magazine if not a bundle of a bunch of great Substackers, just all conveniently put into one product for you to pay for in one go. And these magazines in a way were sort of collectives of these great writers and essayists who had a place to ply their trade.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at that. I I have to work into this interview because I know our listeners would be interested in this as well. The large amount of Yiddishkeit that's in your book. I mean, it's all over the place. Lots of interesting facts, like Condé Nast in the 1990s was pretty much the equivalent of Hollywood in the 1930s. Jewish people bringing popular culture to the world. The Newhouse family was obviously Jewish. Let me tell you that my favorite aspect of that, I don't think in all the many books I've read, articles I've read in my life, fiction and nonfiction, Empire of the Elite is the first time I've ever seen the word nebbish put into a book. So congratulations on that. What did you say? Gottlieb, who was the editor before Tina Brown of the New Yorker, someone wrote a play about him and whatever was
Yes,
going
yes.
on.
Lillian Ross wrote a play. Yeah.
Right, and there was a character, Sheldon Loudbrook, who was supposed to be Gottlieb, and your take on his Sheldon Loudbrook, a nebbish. So good for you. I mean, what led you to put that word in? It just sounded right for the
Oh,
character.
I'm impressed that or maybe I'm surprised you hadn't encountered it in other, well, I find Yiddish to be a very expressive and vivid language. So the words can be quite useful to a writer, and when it's the proper place for it. I probably had to dial back a bit of the shtick in the book, but hopefully I peppered in the right amount. But Nebish also was just the mot juste. It was the right word for that character.
It's great. For some reason, I always loved the word nebbish. And then there's like the closely related word. I don't know whether it's a noun or an adjective, nebuch. Like usually it said like, oh, nebuch, the poor
Oh yes, I think my father's used
Yeah.
that.
Because yeah, my parents used my
Well, my
grandparents.
father grew up speaking Yiddish, so I've inherited a bit of this from him.
Well, there's nothing like Yiddish because it captures things. Like
It's
even in
guttural. It's guttural. It's guttural.
yeah, it's not a nebbish is not really a fool. It's like pitiful is too strong a word. It's like a very unique thing.
Mm.
I like nebbish as being successful. All right, listen, let's wrap this up. Let me say a couple of things and then I'll give you a chance with any final words on this. First of all, on the book, Empire of the Elite by Mike Grynbaum, is going to be published on July 15th. And on that date at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, Mike will be interviewed by Maureen Dowd, who, of course, is a very well-known writer and columnist for the New York Times, and you've seen her on MSNBC and other places as well. So I highly recommend that. This interview, just so everyone knows, was recorded on July 7th, 2025. I always say that because
In
it's
case
not
some
going.
crazy news happens in between.
That's right. Sometimes you hear like, you know, I remember Dick Cavett was very upset, and I can't remember what it was. Something happened in between the time he recorded, one of his, television shows, and whatever it was something. I don't know, it could have been like the Miley massacre. It was some pretty bad thing, like in the late 60s or 70s. And he said,
Uh-huh.
and I look like a jackass here. I'm making jokes, stuff like that. So that's why
Yeah,
I
no, I
love
appreciate it.
that. And let me also say that there will be show notes for this video and the audio that's going to appear. And in the show notes, you'll be able to click on a link that will bring you to a place where you can get, I guess, the Kindle on pre-sale before the book is actually published. And then afterwards, that same link will bring you to where you can buy the book. And I'm sure the book's going to be published in hardcover, softcover, and Kindle. Is that right?
Yes, and for any of your listeners in Europe, it will be there's a British edition that will be distributed also to English language bookstores around Europe and Australia. And it will be available anywhere starting July 15th. I'm very fortunate. Amazon selected it as one of its editors' picks for nonfiction for July, one of 10 books, which is, I was really thrilled to get that news. Yeah, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts about it as well. I have a New York Times page, bio page, and you can reach me through there. And I'm really excited to talk about it with readers.
Great. And anybody who has any questions, feel free, certainly on YouTube or on any of the podcast pages. If you ask any questions, I'll pass them on to Mike. I just want to make sure I didn't leave anything out that I wanted to talk to you about. I think we pretty much covered everything. Oh yeah, there is one last thing that I just wanted to mention, that this comes under the category of something you probably no doubt didn't know. And believe it or not, in 1976, I co-wrote an article that was published by a Condé Nast arch competitor, Harper's Bazaar. Isn't that interesting? And the title of the article is "The Cosmetic Surgery Myth." And the co-writer was Toby Cohn. I have no idea what happened to her. And I have no idea why I even was asked to co-write the article. God knows. I know like zero about cosmetic surgery, but maybe that shows the standards of Harper's Bazaar back in the 1970s. Actually, I do know. She wanted Neil Postman, who was my professor at NYU, to help her and co-write the article. And
Uh-huh.
Postman didn't feel like writing it. And he asked me, would I be willing to write it? So I said, sure. I never turned down an opportunity. Any final words that you would like to share with our audience?
No, I'm really grateful for you having me on, and I was also, as you mentioned, you helped me publish that Sopranos paper and presented at your conference, which was a thrill for me, and maybe my first real published cultural criticism. So your support's meant so much to me over the years, and I'm really thrilled you liked the book.
I love the book, and I'm sure we'll meet at some restaurant or in which the family is going out to dinner. That's happened too. I think one time we were going
Many
out.
times.
Yes. So, or if not that, some kind of group like Troop or Troop
Yeah.
that Simon will talk us into going to see.
Thank you, Paul, so much.
Take care. Bye bye.